Hi, I'm Mark Mattioli, and welcome to another reading of Boston Accent. Boston Accent is available on Amazon.com, and it contains mature subject matter. Let's pick up where we left off. We're starting a new chapter, Chapter 10, Back to Boston. Phil and I spent one day in Sacramento before heading cross-country to Boston. Besides his clothes, he had several boxes of books that were ready to go. It took us less than an hour to pack his car, and the rest of the time was spent saying goodbye to friends Phil had made during his 4-year stay. The next morning, we headed out early after we both made phone calls to the East Coast to tell them that we're on our way. I was concerned about the condition of Phil's car as it was 17 years old, but Phil was confident that it would make it. I did have other concerns going into this trip, which for the most part I kept to myself. The appearance of the car was a concern to me. Phil, although he was 24 years old, continued to exhibit bizarre behavior you might see from someone much younger. Phil was a huge Led Zeppelin fan and had stitched concert t-shirts into the ceiling liner of the car. Now, you might not think that was too bad, but Phil took it one step further by painting Zeppelin anthems and symbols on both sides of the car, the hood, the trunk, and the roof. It's not like Phil was a professional painter. It looked like shit, and it drew unwanted attention to us. Another big concern was Phil had a cat he was transporting in a carrier in the back seat. I am not a big cat person, and I was concerned about the smell from the cat crapping in the cage. I didn't have a whole lot of faith in Phil that he would keep the cage clean. Adding to the cat odor concern was the fact that the passenger window did not roll down. It might get ripe in here due to the fact that Phil and I would not be showering for 5 days as motels were not in our budget. My last concern was the fact that Phil was very much an airhead and his driving skills left a lot to be desired. This combined with the fact that he lacked a great deal of common sense could set us up for a 5-day trip that could be the nightmare of all nightmares. The biggest thing in my favor was the fact that we had been friends since we were 7 years old. I had no problem telling him exactly what was on my mind. It was a 5-day trip cross-country made by two long-term friends. What's the worst that could happen? Oh, did I mention Phil had no car radio or stereo of any kind? Phil and I had agreed to share the driving so we could make as much progress as possible. As we weren't staying in any motels, campgrounds, or rest areas, we would basically be driving non-stop across the country. Phil was very concerned that this game plan might be too much on the car, and he asked me to keep my speed at 55. I agreed to take it easy and kept it at 55 for the most part, but the condition of the car was against us, and we had problems 55 or not. Our first problem came up going over the Rockies when the radiator blew. We were forced to spend the night in a motel in Wyoming while the garage we brought the car to checked the local junkyards for a replacement. This was an unexpected expenditure that put a serious hit on our travel funds. The next day, the car was repaired and we were on our way. We were almost into our third day on the road, and we're less than a third of the way across the country. Phil insisted on driving all night, and I grabbed the opportunity to sleep while it was actually dark. It's tough enough sleeping all crouched up in a small car, but with an unhappy cat in the back seat, it just made it next to impossible. The cat cried pretty much the entire trip. Phil resorted to letting the cat loose to wander around the back of the car. When the cat was loose, it cried less, but it was going to the bathroom wherever it pleased, and the car began to reek. I could not get to the East Coast fast enough. When Phil slept, I would push the speed up to 70 to try and make some time. It's now mid-morning of day 3, and I wake up after sleeping for a solid 3 hours to find Phil driving on what is clearly a rural back road. I look around confused and ask, "Where are we?" To which Phil replies, "Don't yell at me." The first thing that comes to my mind is, this is not a good response, and I say, "I'm not yelling. I'm asking you a question." I don't know exactly, Phil answers in almost a whisper. What do you mean you don't know? I say, coming up out of my seat and raising my voice enough to get the cat crying again. I told you not to yell at me, is Phil's first response to my growing irritation. I take a deep breath and motion to Phil to answer the question. Phil begins to tell me that we were getting low on gas, so he got off the highway to fill up. Finding the gas station was no problem, but when he went to get back on the highway, he must have gone the wrong way because he never saw the on-ramp. How long ago was that? I ask him through clenched teeth, and he says, about an hour. I could pretty much find my way anywhere in the daylight by using the sun, so I tell Phil to pull over and let me drive. He's been driving for over 12 hours and needs a break anyway, and I tell him so. I can tell from the sun that we're headed east, which is the way we want to go, and I figure eventually we will run into the highway again if we stay on this course. Phil takes the cat for a potty break while I check out the map to try to determine our approximate location. Phil returns with the cat, cleans up some cat turds from the floor, and we're on our way. We're less than 5 miles down the road, and Phil and the cat are both sound asleep. Another 10 miles, and I see a ramp for the highway, and we're back in business. We are problem-free until we get to Illinois, just outside of Chicago, when we drive into a huge storm. The rain is coming down in a torrential downpour, and Phil is back behind the wheel. We were both scared shit because of the road conditions and the fact that we're sharing the road with tractor trailers that are flying past us. Phil has reduced his speed to roughly 40 miles an hour, and the passing trucks are flashing their lights at us and blasting the air horns to get out of the way. Phil gets too close to the side of the road and drives through a large body of standing water that goes right over the roof of the car and totally blinds us for a couple of seconds, with the windshield being underwater. This puts Phil into further panic, and he pulls into the breakdown lane. What are you doing? You can't sit here. No one can see us and we'll get rear-ended. I yell at him while I watch the rear window, waiting to see a large truck bearing down on us. At the same time, whenever a truck passes us in the next lane, the entire car would shake, and that's when it happened. The engine died. Phil tried to restart it, and it wouldn't. When I got to the point where I thought he would kill the battery, I yelled at him to stop. I told him the wires were wet from the puddle, and he needed to dry them off, and maybe the distributor cap too. Phil disagreed. Have I mentioned that Phil is stubborn? Imagine the most stubborn person you know, and multiply it by 10. That's Phil. He didn't agree and said he was going to run ahead, get off at the first off-ramp, and find a gas station with a tow truck. As soon as Phil left running down the breakdown lane in the rain, I grabbed the T-shirt out of my bag in the back, popped the hood, and began drying off the wires. I unclipped the distributor cap, but it was dry inside. When I dried the wires as best as I could, with the conditions I had, I closed the hood and jumped behind the wheel. I turned the key, and the motor came to life. I had no one to high-five, so I shared my triumph with the cat who was up in the rear window crying. The cat continued to cry as I drove down the breakdown lane with my emergency flashes on until I saw Phil. I laid on the horn right behind him, scaring the shit out of him. He jumped in the car, amazed that I'd fixed it by the simple act of drying off the wires. I drove on, determined to get us out of the storm and closer to home. After surviving Chicago, we had one more minor incident of a flat tire, and Phil actually had a spare. It was bald and low in air, but we managed to limp to a service station with an air pump, and once again we're on our way. At this point, we're in New York, and we'll be home that same night. Home for both of us meant our parents' house, as we had nowhere else to go. I'm pretty sure our parents were glad to have us closer. They just didn't want us in the same house with them. Phil and I shook hands that night in my parents' driveway before he made the short drive to his parents. It was September 1981. I would not see him again for 9 years. Settling back at my parents was not an easy thing. A lot had changed, and since I had left for California 2 years prior. My brother, who was attending a private Catholic school in Boston, was sharing his bedroom with a French foreign exchange student named Marcel. Marcel and my brother were both freshmen in high school, and they rode the bus together into Boston every day for one school year, and then Marcel would return to France. My old room had been transformed into a den with a TV and an office desk, but it had a couch to open to a bed. This is where I would sleep. Everything seemed a lot less tense in my parents' house, although I had the feeling that everyone was holding their breath waiting to see what I would do next. I learned quickly that my family was not a big fan of Marcel, and they were regretting opening their home to him. Marcel had some bad habits that my family found unacceptable, such as refusing to bathe on a daily basis, farting at the dinner table, and picking his nose constantly. Add to that the fact that he was the most arrogant 14-year-old you would ever meet. He was hard to be around. I quickly found myself on the anti-Marcel bandwagon and began to count the days when he would return to France. My relationship with my stepfather Ralph was like night and day since my return. Although he still did not go out of his way to have a relationship with me on any level, at least we weren't fighting. All his anger seemed to be channeled on Marcel, so I stayed under the radar as much as possible. One evening I was surprised to find a note on my pillow from Ralph asking me to score him a bag of weed for a coworker of his. He asked me to leave the bag under the driver's front seat of his car and to please keep this between me and him. I read the note over and over. It was the most bizarre thing to happen in our piss-poor relationship. I scored the weed and put it in his car, and we never spoke of it to this day. I set out looking for a job as soon as I was back in town, and there wasn't much work available. I also didn't have a car, which was a huge problem, as that was one of the first questions out of a potential employer's mouth. I ended up getting a job pumping gas at a station 2 miles from my parents' house. I would walk the distance back and forth every day and didn't consider it a big deal. I'd walk farther than this more often in Tahoe when I didn't have the dollar for bus fare. Walking in October wasn't too bad, but walking in January and February was rough. I had grown a beard. By the time I got to the gas station at 5:30 a.m. to open, my mustache would be covered in ice. I never let it get to me. I only told myself that I was responsible for my life at this moment, and I would be responsible for making it better. It was now winter 1982, and I had been back from Tahoe for 8 months. I tried to get a hold of Diana so I could visit Alex, but her mother told me they were living in Florida, and that was all she knew. She also told me that her husband had been busted in Maine unloading bales of weed from Colombia. He was a small player and would serve 5 years. Penny suggested I come by for a drink. I could tell by the way she slurred her words that she had started without me, and it was 10 a.m. I told her I'd be over, but I never made it. Okay, we're going to end it right there. We're going to call it a day, and I'll pick this up at another time. God willing, we'll do this again tomorrow. I'm Mark Mattioli. We're reading Boston Accent, and Boston Accent is available on Amazon.com. Ciao.